Welcome to Malibu, California, and the campus of Pepperdine University School of Public Policy. I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful dean of the school, and we are here in the great books room of the Payson Library here on campus, kicking off the second season of our Office Hours of Victor Davis Hanson series. This is our first episode of 3 this season, and like last year, the premise of the show is to welcome in Dr. Hanson, who is our Giles-O'Malley Distinguished Visiting Professor, and to look back at the day before, just yesterday, and the class that he taught here to our graduate students. We'll be talking about that specific class and some current events in as well. And so without further ado, we welcome in our Giles-O'Malley Distinguished Professor, Dr. Victor Davis Hanson.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Hanson, the class that you are teaching this semester to our graduate students is titled Leadership and Key Decisions of World War II. Why is it important for graduate policy students who may be working for the city of Los Angeles or may go off to Capitol Hill or the Foreign Service? Why is it important for them to understand World War II and these important decisions and leadership skills that were demonstrated 70, 80 years ago?
Well, in general, war accelerates history because, after all, it's a question of people dying and existential borders, the history or the future of civilization. So this is the period in which, you have new technologies, everything from napalm to synthetic rubber to antibiotics to the atomic bomb. So people work harder, they work faster, and it kind of crystallizes history. That's why the ancients, Thucydides, Herodotus, all ancient history was synonymous with military history. And World War II was the most catastrophic human event in history. 70 to 75 million people died. And there were choices that both prevented 300 million people dying, and there were choices that resulted in 70 million people. So these are some of the biggest choices that affected not just the 1940s, but our lives today. And so if you look at the major leaders, and for this class I looked at the belligerents as the Allies after 1941, and that would have been Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and then their opponents, Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, and General Tojo, and tried to see why they made the decisions they made and what were the consequences of the decision, with one caveat, that we in the present, in our affluence and bounty and peace and chances of introspection and second guessing, don't apply, at least exclusively apply our values or our worldview or the world of 2024 and then judge them. But rather we have to take into consideration what it was like in 1939 or 1940. When people say, well, why didn't Roosevelt go in earlier? What was the political situation where he couldn't, or he wouldn't have been reelected in 1940? What level of deception did he have to operate? What was the unemployment rate in 1938? All of these factors. And then the other general theme of the class is that when you make these choices, it's almost never 100% zero. It's 51-49. It's the better choice. But in our age, I think because of technology and affluence, we have the idea if it's not perfect, it's not good. And then how does the leader articulate those choices? And it just turned out that one of the reasons that Adolf Hitler was so successful until he met the Allies was that he was I didn't find him, when you listen to some of his speeches, they don't seem persuasive to me, but they were persuasive at the time. And Roosevelt was a great orator. Stalin wasn't. And he had problems with that. Mussolini was a great orator. So when you look at, you say, why would people listen to Mussolini or Hitler? It's partly because they were electrifying, at least at the time. And so we talk about all these elements of leadership that enhance or detract from a political decision.
Now, you're using several books, resources in the course. Two of them I wanted to cite here because they were readings that you had assigned to students yesterday. One is your book, The Second World Wars, and the second by historian Ian Kershaw, Fateful Choices Here. So for the rest of the conversation here, I wanted to pull out some quotations that you had assigned to the students yesterday. But maybe first I want to talk about the title of your book, The Second World Wars, which, to be clear, is in the plural. And you write this about the title, quote, "I titled this book The Second World Wars for two reasons. One, no supposedly single conflict was ever before fought on so many diverse landscapes on premises that often seemed unrelated. And two, never had a war been fought in so many different ways. To the extent that a rocket attack on London or jungle fighting in Burma or armor strikes in Libya seemed to belong to entirely different wars." Why is it important that students of history, in thinking about the Second World War, World War II, why is it important to think about it in the plural?
Well, a lot of students in today's youthful generation don't even know what World War II is. So I was trained as a philologist of classical languages, so I always start with the language. So when I ask the students, why is it called the Second World War? It is in Britain, and here it's called World War II, but where did the two or second come from? In fact, that didn't come until somewhere around 1940 to 41. Mostly, it was occasionally used, but up until the invasion of Russia by Hitler in June 22nd of 1941, there was the Great War, something they'd never seen before, that had destroyed European youth, and 17 million people are dead. Then it starts 20 years later, but they think it's over with Poland. So that was the Polish War. And then there's the phony war, where nothing happens. And then there is quickly the Scandinavian War, where it goes into Denmark and Norway. And then it's the invasion of the Low Countries and the battle for France. But they're all separate, segmented, that people thought that they were going to be self-contained. Then he invades the Soviet Union in 1941, and suddenly there's 240 million people in the largest country by area in the world. Then there's December 7th, and we're in it. And then everybody says, you know what, there's no longer a Great War. It's World War I. And this is World War II. So I was trying to explain in the book, all of these regional wars were not seen at the time as cataclysmic. It was only when the United States and the Soviet Union, and then people said, oh yeah, all of them were precursors and part of that global war. And the other reason, of course, was I'll just take the example of my family. So during Thanksgiving, when I was growing up in the 50s, I had an uncle-in-law, and he was stationed in the Aleutians, and he would tell us, he was wounded in the arm, and he was telling us it was below freezing and how hard it was. And during the Battle of Midway, they came up there, the Japanese, and bombed some of the islands that he had been stationed. But it seemed like Arctic warfare. And then my mother would talk about my father's first cousin, who was adopted as her brother, was killed on Okinawa. And I had been reading his letters even as a kid. And it was just a different landscape. It was island fighting. Right. And then my father, who flew on a B-29, 41 missions over Tokyo, starting out at 30,000 feet, and under LeMay they went down to the fire raids at 7, and being on these 16-hour round trips, 8 hours from Tinian all the way over the target for 6 or 7 minutes, no parachutes, because if you bailed out you were going to be executed, flying back, and then how wonderful it was that Iwo Jima was captured because they crashed twice and were saved. Well, that didn't seem to have anything to do with the Aleutians, much less island hopping. And then my mother's first cousin, Holt Cather, landed, I think, a month after D-Day, and was killed by a sniper in Belgium, fighting in a forest against the Germans. So somebody's fighting the Japanese, somebody's fighting the Germans, somebody's on an island called Tinian, and they don't seem to have anything connected. And yet when they talked, and then I had a first cousin, Dick Davis, who was in Patton's Third Army, and I had another cousin Bob Hanson, and his job was to be a logistics officer somehow to unload ships in Iran and then drive them on a convoy through Iran into southern Russia, not get hit by Army Group South, and literally deliver Studebaker trucks to the Russian Army, and they immediately then used them. And they had nothing in common. And I don't think, there was, once in a while they'd have arguments. The Japanese were tougher, well, the Germans were more organized. It was horrible up in the sky. Well, you don't know what it was like down in that kind of stuff.
Right.
But I was trying to explain to people that this connection of a uniform, coherent, one theater, one war, second, is a little bit simplistic.
Well, and I think you raise a very interesting point there, which goes to one of the themes of the class that you're teaching, which is even the name of the title, World War II, that was not seen by any of the actors even into 1940.
No.
And it speaks to a larger theme that I think you often talk about in your classes and in your writing, which is this ongoing presence of irony, that things nobody anticipated things exploding the way they did. And we'll get into more of that here. But it's so easy for us looking back to say all the participants at the beginning knew that they were entering into a major catastrophic global war, but it really went step by step.
None of them did.
Yep.
They all thought that that it was contained. When Hitler went into Poland and carved it up with Joseph Stalin, his partner coming in from the east, they thought that was the end. In fact, there was a great discussion among the Chief of Staff, Franz Halder, that maybe you could start to decommission divisions in the German army. And Albert Speer, who was, at this time, he wasn't the architect of the economy, he was the architect of rebuilding this supposed metropolis called Berlin, which is going to be the global capital of the world. And he had all of these kind of grotesque domes, buildings that were going to be bigger than the Vatican Dome, things like that. And they thought that they had won.
Yeah.
And when you count the capitals, Lisbon, Madrid, Paris, Oslo, Stockholm, Rome, Athens, they were either under Nazi control or pro-Nazi or Nazi themselves. And then there was only little Churchill there. I say little Churchill, Britain.
Yeah.
Another thing, one other theme was that we in the United States kind of deprecate the British role. And in this, a recent interview by Tucker Carlson, he had a person on, Daryl Cooper, that was pretty much anti-British. But one thing we forget is, of all the 6 major belligerents, Britain was the only one that went to war on the principle of territorial integrity of someone else. Every other of the 5 either invaded another country to start the war, or they were invaded, us included, or attacked. The other thing is, they were the only country to fight September 2nd and 3rd, 1939, September 2nd, 1945, the entire 6 years.
Right.
And they were the only country who went into the war knowing that whether they won or lost, they were going to be diminished.
Weaker.
And they were going to lose the fight. Hitler thought they were going to win. Mussolini thought it was going to be a new Rome. Japan thought it was going to be the greater Asian co-prosperity sphere. We thought we were going to, of course we always think we're going to win, and we were going to replace Britain as the world's policeman. But they were very pessimistic. They were broke. The empire, they owed the empire in those dollars well over $1 billion. They owed us even more from World War I. And they just didn't think it was going to end well, and yet they did it.
Yeah.
And that was Churchill.
Let's turn to the beginnings then of World War II. Most who've studied the rise of the Axis powers, voiced in the early 1920s and 1930s, saw the connection to World War I. And you write in the Second World Wars, again I'll quote, "Almost every public proclamation that the Allies voiced in the 1920s and early 1930s projected at least an appearance of limited and that invited war from what we were still relatively weak powers." Unquote. So looking at Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, in Europe and Japan in Asia. How did weak responses from the Allies invite military responses?
War breaks out when there's not an accurate appraisal of the actual strength, so it's of the relatively concerned belligerents. Sort of like you go into a bar and there's 8 or 9 people. You don't go attack somebody because you size up how big he is and whether he has tattoos and a broken teeth or something. So it's very important for a state to be transparent. But during the 30s and after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 23rd, 1939, the Soviet Union did not make clear how powerful it was. It was very powerful. It had the best tank in the world, the T-34. It had the largest area, it had a huge population, but it collaborated or colluded with Hitler, and he thought that they needed Hitler. The United States was isolationist, and Britain and France were appeasing. It was almost as if the victors of World War I would do anything not to repeat Verdun or the Somme, and the losers of World War I said, we came that close. And they wanted a war, or they were at least open to it. The second thing that happened, and this is kind of counterintuitive, the Versailles Treaty combined the worst of both worlds. It was not an unconditional surrender. So they surrendered on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, they being the central powers, central powers of World War I. They were inside France and Belgium. And General Foch and General Pershing said, do not let them get away with this. And we had this Woodrow Wilson who had sent 2 million, almost 2 million people at this point. Amazing logistical achievement. And we were the sudden infusion after 3 years that saved the Allies. Not that we carried the greatest burden, France and Britain did, but he had enormous say, and he was a utopian college president from Princeton. And so he said, we're not going to be punitive. And Haig and Foch and Pershing, the big three generals, said, they don't think they're beaten. They are beaten, they're exhausted, they're broke. They've sent 500,000 people from Russia that they knocked out of the war, and just let us have a few more months and we'll go into Berlin. And notice, we didn't do this enough at the end of World War II. It was unconditional surrender. We're going to go occupy Germany. We're going to divide it up under spheres of influence, and we're going to rebuild it under our auspices. And we've had peace ever since. The other big misapprehension is, well, the Versailles Treaty was too mean. It had the war guilt clause. It made them pay reparations. It wasn't nearly as mean as 1914, the Kaiser's plan, had he taken Paris, the September program, he called it. They were going to take all the coastal ports of France, and then they were going to just absorb Belgium. Or it wasn't nearly as mean as 1918 with the Brest-Litovsk Treaty that they inflicted on Russia, where they took 50 million people and 1 million square miles of Russia and incorporated into greater Austria and Germany. It wasn't nearly as mean as after World War II. But the problem with Versailles was not that it was too punitive, but the language was harsh and the implementation or the enforcement was weak. So you talk loud and carry a twig rather than talk softly with a big stick. And that infuriated Germany, and of course they went right back into Germany, and during the Versailles Treaty they said, we didn't lose. We were stabbed in the back by Jews and communists, and that Hitler was off to the races.
One of the fascinating points that you make in the Second World Wars is the vast difference between World War I and World War II when it comes to the victims. I don't think a lot of people think about just how different the two wars were as it related to victims that were either military or civilian. And so I wanted to pull out this quotation again from your book, The Second World Wars. Quote, the majority of the 17 million who perished in World War I were combatants, 59%, and there were roughly even losses among the Allied and Central Powers. World War II was largely a deliberate effort to kill civilians, mostly on the part of the Axis powers. Most of the fatalities were not soldiers, Perhaps 70 to 80% of the commonly cited 60 million who died in World War II were civilians, unquote. Why is it important, again, as students looking back at World War II, to understand this significant difference? And to your point, that actually civilians, really for one of the first times in military history, at least on this scale, really were the targets of, in this case, the Axis powers.
Well, the combatants of World War I had defined war in classical terms as a front, and both sides were going to fight in the trenches, which is pretty horrific, 17 million. There were areas in Africa or the Middle East, but they were minor in comparison. But they did not have the technology at that point to inflict damage on civilian centers. They didn't have very good bombers, they had balloons. World War II, in that 20-year hiatus, there were great thinkers in Germany and Britain and America, Duat, Billy Mitchell, and Liddell Hart, and they were speculating that now with technology, airplanes would be able to go over the lines and attack industrial centers. And that would create a logic of escalation. If you're going to attack a factory, what's the difference in attacking the homes of the factory workers? Or if you're going to take territory, and you would have mobile vehicles, not clunky trunks or horses, but tanks and trucks that could go 50 miles an hour. Trucks could go 50, 60 miles an hour. Tanks could go 20 or 30. You could invade large swaths of territory like the Soviet Union. And that would mean you would be confronted with large population centers behind the enemy line. So part of it was technologically driven. But the other part, and I think it's very important to get to your question, why we know this, is that we have all this revisionism now. There's this Western self-loathing. We bombed Dresden, we bombed Hamburg, we bombed Tokyo. And we did. And
the atomic bombs as well.
Yes, and that was probably 1 million people died in Germany and Japan put together through Allied bombing. But if you want to be exact about it, in one sense, World War II was the story of German soldiers and the government's support of that military effort to kill Russians, Poles, and Jews. And the Japanese government's soldiers and the government's support of that to kill Chinese civilians, Pacific Islanders, and Southeast Asians. And if you add all of those numbers up, and when I wrote the book, 60 million was considered the conservative estimate, but now I think people say it might, some recent research said it might be 70 or 75 million because the Russians were not transparent about how many they lost, nor were the Chinese. And you take those figures and then you look at the actual numbers of Germans who died, civilian and military, maybe 3 million, maybe 3.5, or the number of Japanese, 2.5 to 3 million. You end up with the most lethal kill ratio. So the people that we say were being terrorized by us actually were killing machines. In other words, at the loss of 3 or 4 million people, the German army in Russia probably killed somewhere around 25 to 30 million Russians. They killed 6 million in the death camps, and they probably killed another 2 million of people in Eastern Europe and Allied soldiers. And
by and large civilians, again, we're talking about.
And Japan was even more lethal. They probably lost 2.5 million people. They were not bombed, see, until basically in 1945, the homeland. If you count all of their civilian and all their military dead, and then you put on the other side of the ledger what they were unleashed on China, and that was just they targeted civilians almost exclusively. They targeted people in the Philippines when they took over. They targeted people in Southeast Asia. They targeted people in Malaysia. Of course, the Allies as well. And Japan probably they probably killed somewhere between 20 and 25 people at the cost of 2.5. So what I'm trying to say is they killed 10 times more people than they suffered. And that was not true if you look at the British. are the Americans. And so when the revisionists say, well, Churchill was a terrorist, or we were doing this, they have no idea of the actual data of all these millions of people who died by the direct policies of the Japanese imperial government, of the Germans. And I get very upset sometimes when the revisionists about the atomic bombs or the fire raids, they go the next step and they start to champion the Japanese. Kind of feeds into the DEI whole industry as well, of revisionism. And I don't think they have any idea that in 1941, 42, 43, 44, 45, people in Asia were terrified of the Japanese. They were considered lethal killers. And if you did not obey them, they killed you, whether it was in Manchuria or Mongolia or earlier in 19th. And the same was true of the Germans. They had a reputation of as very lethal killers. And I don't think people understand that.
So you make a very good point about the differences between World War I and World War II as it related to the victims, and in part precipitated by, frankly, killing technology.
Yes. And ideology too.
And that's what I wanted to get to, because that is another significant difference you point out in the Second World Wars between World War I and World War II, and the lethality of the two wars. So I wanted to pull out this quotation here. 20th century incarnations of totalitarianism, whether German Nazism, Italian fascism, Soviet communism, or Japanese militarism, often made the aggressors erratic rather than circumspect and predictable. We often talk at the policy school, use that Richard Weaver phrase, ideas have consequences. And much different than World War I, which were, you actually had family members fighting one another between the two countries. In this, there really was an ideological bent to the powers, which particularly on the Axis side, but to a degree on the Allied side, really did contribute to the amount of killing and people who were, and countries that are essentially ripped apart by this ideology. Why is it important to understand that dimension?
Well, you can really see the difference in the nature of revisionism. I don't agree with the revisionist historians of World War I, but I can understand their argument. And their argument is, you have these European countries, and then you have a parliamentary monarchy in Britain, and you have a socialist republic in France. And on the other side, you have the Kaiser, but he does have a parliament. And you have a more extreme and more authoritarian Prussian version of these other consensual societies, and to a lesser extent in Austria. So there's not an ideological difference. Now there is, Hitler's predecessors about this crazy Aryan white supremacy were writing in the 1890s, but it hadn't been mainstream. So when Germany went to war, for example, they had plenty of Jews. In fact, one of the tragedies of the Holocaust is World War I veterans were going to the ovens with their iron crosses of bravery. And so the differences were more territorial or classical. We want this land, the Alsace-Lorraine, or trade concessions. It was more about Germany felt they didn't have enough colonies, they'd been cheated by the British Empire. Not so in World War II. Nazi ideology really did think that there was this, they made up this word, I mean, it had been rarely used, really, Aryanism or Aryan. And they felt that it was the duty of a superior race to have Lebensraum, or room to multiply, and there was, they didn't like the Dutch, they didn't like the French, they didn't like the British, but they considered them cousins to Aryanism, but not so Jews and Slavs and Russians. So they thought that we're going to go in, ultimately the message of Mein Kampf is to go into Russia and take all this land from these, what German philosophical and racial work before the 20th century said we're Untermenschen.
Lesser.
Subhumans.
Yes.
And in the Japanese sense, it was very parallel. They felt that the greater Asian co-prosperity sphere was that a superior Asian race, superior to all other races, was going to lift up these inferior Asian races as a bulwark against these hostile, inferior white races. And the same thing about Mussolini. He felt that Rome had been founded on superior Italian stock, and they had been cheated and diminished by other powers, among them Germany. And he felt that with his navy, he was going to recreate Mare Nostrum of the Roman Empire, but the Italians would finally be the master race again in the Mediterranean. They kind of worked out a deal. We'll be the master race in the Mediterranean. You have all of Northern Europe. But the point I mean is once you start talking about predestination and that this is a totalitarian idea, it's not just economics, it's not culture, it's not civilization, it's race, innate race, then almost any means justified to achieve that end were taken. And on the other side, we really didn't talk about, we did a little bit under Wilson about the superior democracy, but it's not that we didn't think the war was for our way of American way, like we did, but the problem was, whereas the Axis were all unified in their totalitarian racist ideas, they were all dictators. The Allies, they were very disparate. They had a British monarchy with a king, and then they had a constitutional republic, and then they had a ruthless, murderous communist Soviet Union. So it was hard for any one power to say, if Stalin couldn't quite say, although he thought it, this is a war for Soviet communism to take over the world. This is a war for American democracy. This is a war to have the British Empire. They couldn't do it. And the final irony was that you think that they would have a lot more solidarity, the Axis powers. But they were always double-crossing each other. Hitler goes into Soviet Union, and Mussolini said he didn't tell me. I'll fix him. Mussolini goes into the Balkans, and Hitler says, I'm going to go into Russia. And he's now screwed up my timetable. And then they bomb Japan, and Hitler goes, where is Pearl Harbor? So they had no coordination.
I wanted to pull that quote. I actually had it here because I think it is really such a profound point in describing the two sides of World War II. This is the quotation again from your book, Second World Wars, that was assigned to yesterday's class. Quote, tragic irony was always a trademark of World War II. The Allies had little ideological affinity, yet fought as partners in pursuit of righteous revenge. The Axis were kindred fascists, but waged aggressive war at cross purposes and as individual belligerents in dreams of their own particular aggrandizement.
There were two things that the Allies, two arguments that they had over the Axis that made them work together. The first is they didn't start the war. So Stalin would say, we didn't double-cross Germany. They invaded us. The Americans say, they attacked us on Pearl Harbor. And Britain said, they went into Poland, not us. And the Axis were then cast as the aggressors. And they never quite got over that propaganda. They tried to say they were defensive wars, but no one believed them. And so that was important. The other thing is totalitarian, authoritarian, dictatorial leaders who are not accountable to the people usually can't be trusted. They had three of them. And so they were treating each other the way they treated their own public, lying to them, being non-transparent. But in the case of the Allies, they had two that were responsible for a congressional or a judicial oversight. FDR was not a totalitarian, even if he wanted to be. He had two houses of Congress and the Supreme Court. And even if Winston Churchill had wanted to be a tyrant, he had an opposition in the House of Commons. And so
and he was tossed out after the conclusion of hostilities.
He was. He was thrown out after, and Roosevelt held an election in 1940, right in the middle, right on the eve of the war, and in 44, right in the middle of the war. And so they had it was more likely, not guaranteed, but it was more likely that they had to be a little bit more predictably honest. They had to honor agreements. Stalin broke every agreement after the war, but during the war he actually kept many of his promises. And Britain and the United States kept their promises, and that was unusual. The axis just continually double-crossed each other.
I don't think a lot of people think about that specific point, especially when it comes to the level of coordination that happened among the Allied powers versus the Axis powers. I mean, obviously there are many examples of this, but just to point out one, D-Day, the level of coordination that had to happen between Allied powers to pull that off was just, there was just nothing comparable on the Axis side, that level of actual military coordination.
Part of it was facilitated by the Anglo-American. They spoke the common language. They were very close allies, but it was here we are, we just go into their country and we put 500,000 men there, and then finally by the time of D-Day, 70% of the war effort to be in Europe is going to come from us. And yet we make Eisenhower the supreme commander of SHAPE, the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force. But then we get Montgomery, we give him equal title with Bradley as the two subordinates, and the commander of the fleet is British. So they were very careful of British sensitivities, that we were guests in their island. And you can really see it where there was almost no cooperation on the tactical level between Italy, Japan, and Germany. I mean, Japan had some wonderful ideas about engines and airplane engines. Germany's subs could have really helped, but there was no contact. When the Americans needed a escort fighter to go all the way to Berlin, they came up with a brilliant aerodynamic P-51, but the Allison engine didn't cut it. So the British came over and said, well, we have this Merlin engine we put in Spitfires, and we've got a supersized version. If we put it in your airframe, and they did, and it became the most effective fighter of World War II. Fastest speed, greatest rate of climb. Same thing as when the Americans and the British, they encountered a Tiger tank for the first time in North Africa. They see Panther tanks in Italy, and they say, we have nothing that can stop them. And the British said, well, actually, we have what they called a 17-pounder. High velocity, something around 77 millimeter. It can go through a Tiger tank. But the problem is it has a terrible recoil, and our tanks are not very reliable. Your Sherman tanks, for every 10 hours they're on the road, they only need about an hour of maintenance. You can take the transmission out, and you make a lot of them. Maybe we could take our gun and put it into your turret. And it was very hard to do because it was so powerful. It pushed the tank back. But when we got into, after Normandy, almost one Firefly for every 5 Shermans. So every time they saw a Tiger tank, there wasn't very many of them, they just sort of backed off, and the Firefly came up and blew it up at well over a mile. That was that type of cooperation at all levels that really helped win World War II.
You've talked about it in other books about the importance of regime type as it relates to decision making as well, right? This, the point that you've just made here is that there really was a lack of collaboration between totalitarians, because like totalitarians, they don't trust one another. This is versus the democracies that have people to answer to, and government structures as well that have to be included in decision making. But you've also said, even when it comes to the military decision making, so the decisions made by military leaders, that there's a difference in democracies, that you tend to see a greater diversity of thought in those decisions. Whereas when you look at the totalitarian regimes, not only are they led by a single person, but the diversity of thought that's present in making these very crucial decisions, as Kershaw says, these fateful choices are often made with limited participation and feedback.
That's very important, especially on the question of responsibility and culpability. So when the German generals go in on Operation Barbarossa on June 22nd of 1941.
Into
Franz
Russia.
Halder writes in his diary, for all practical purpose, the war in Russia has been won in 11 days. There was euphoria, and Hitler is a saint, a genius. But as they go on during the summer and Stalin rallies and they start to lose 600,000 casualties, then they start bickering and they say, we didn't do this. It was Hitler did it. And they start getting angry. When we go into Normandy and there are screw-ups, they say, well, this was the decision of Churchill, this was the decision of Roosevelt, we hashed it out in a military conference, our generals complain, and everybody is responsible, both for the victory and for the defeat. And it's typical of a constitutional society that then there's and I guess we would call that legitimacy. It's a legitimate process, but when you're in a dictatorial system, it can be much more efficient, but there's no margin of error. Once it starts, that decision starts to show to be flawed, it was never arrived at legitimately. Mm-hmm. And so then people criticize it and say they had no part of it, human nature being what it is. I didn't do it. It's not my fault. Mm-hmm. This is Guderian, Rommel, Van Mans. They were all complaining about Hitler. They were not complaining about Hitler when they went into France and won in 6 weeks. And he knew that. And Thucydides, the historian of the Peloponnesian War, who was no fan of radical democracy, he was for more of a broad-based oligarchy or maybe a landed democracy. But after the Sicilian disaster of 413, when Athens sends this huge armada 800 miles from Athens to attack the largest democracy in the Greek world, Syracuse, and it fails, everybody thinks Athens is going to be wiped out. But then he says, as is always true in a democracy, they have an amazing ability to reconstruct, and then everybody gets together. They all have different ideas. There's new bloods infused, and Athens rebuilds its fleet, and the Spartans can't believe it. Mm-hmm. And it's bad and good, and in that history he talks about the bad parts, whether it's going into Milos and suddenly killing everybody. But you can see it in the United States that we go into the Me Too, and then almost suddenly we're in this hysteria where every man in America thinks that somebody's going to come out of his distant past and say he's a sexist or something. Or we went into the woke thing, and we go into these mass groupthink. Mm. But the upside of it is, all of a sudden, 75% of the people who have said they do not want to fight World War II under any circumstances, all of a sudden they're attacked, and now it's 90% want to go to war, and things like Louisville Slugger factory that makes baseball bats is now making military components, and everybody's coming out, I have this idea, I have this. And it's pretty scary and impressive at the same time about democracies. And the key, again, is legitimacy. They're able to create legitimacy or unification of thought, and it can be dangerous sometimes. But sometimes it's very good in war.
Let's conclude with something from one of the other books that you had students read, not only for yesterday, but for the rest of the semester. And this, again, is Ian Kershaw's book, Fateful Choices. And he breaks it up into a series of 10 decisions and really focuses right at the beginning.
Yes,
to show that, right, 40 and 41, there were decisions made that really did set the course for the war that would continue unto 1945. We talked a bit about one of those fateful choices that was assigned for yesterday, which was the rise of Churchill and Churchill's place. And you just alluded to just a second ago the second that you would assign for yesterday, which was Hitler's decision to attack the Soviet Union. Talk a little bit more about that decision and how that really, at very early stage of the war, 1941, really did set the course for events that would continue for years after.
Well, if you look at 1941, June 22nd, when Hitler goes in, it seems mystifying, because although he can't take Britain can't do much to him, and he's got a very effective submarine campaign that looks like it might be able to cut off all support from North America. He's got all of the resources of Europe at his disposal, and the Soviet Union is supplying about anywhere from 20 to 30 or 40% of his war needs. So why would he attack it? And there's usually three reasons. One is ideological, that he was embarrassed by, or he found it problematic that he had made a deal in the first place with Stalin. The only reason he did on August 23rd of 1939 was he looked back at World War I. And he said, the reason we lost World War I, we had a two-front war. Had we not attacked the Tsar, we could have finished off, and we're not going to make that mistake again. So when I go in to France and Western Europe, and even when I go into Poland, I'm going to have the Soviet Union either on my side or not at war. That was a good reason why he had this partnership. But it was contrary to his ideology. His ideology in Mein Kampf was eventually the German people, now they're united with the Sudetenland and Austria. There's 80 million of us and we don't have enough room. We've got to go take Ukraine, Belarus, etc. So he always wanted to do it, but practically it was a two-front war. Second, he argued to the generals, there is no two-front war now because Britain is neutered, it's just static, it's ossified. That was not true. They were fighting in North Africa and everything. But he said, no, it's not a two-front war. In fact, he added to that second corollary a very important point. He said, it's just it's burdensome, it's an irritant. We can't do it, but I know how we can get rid of the irritant. We take the Soviet Union and it will be so depressed and so isolated that the United States will never come in to help it, and we will have so many resources that it will seek concessions. The third reason he went in, he looked at the history of the Soviet Union, and he said, and people had warned him, do you know anything about Charles XII, what happened to him from Sweden when he tried it? Do you have any idea what Napoleon's Grand Army did? And he said, no. That was under the Tsar. These are communists. In 1922, they invaded Poland. They couldn't even take Poland. In the Winter War of 1939, they attacked our friend the Finns. And they fought for 5 months. And the Finns only had about 1 million men at arms, and they had capable of 5 million man army. And the Finns killed, wounded 500,000 of them. And they had to make a deal with the Finns, and they never could take Finland. That was number two. And then they said, well, look at World War I. World War I, we knocked Russia out in 1917, but we never could take Western Europe. So the ratio is it just took 2.5 years to take Russia, and it took 4 years, and we still couldn't do it. Now, we took Western Europe out in 6 weeks. So according to that World War I arithmetic, 6 weeks in the West, it'll take 3 weeks, just like World War I. Whatever the ratio was in World War I, he felt it was only half as difficult to go into Russia. So he told everybody, 4 years, 2 years, 6 weeks, 3 weeks. And that's how he miscalculated, and people had tried to tell him. They did take Finland. I mean, they forced Mannerheim for a decision. They fight well. They don't fight very well when they go over and fight the Russo-Japanese War. They do not fight when they go well, but they're a different army when you go into their country. So your model is flawed. And then they said, and you don't know anything about their technology. He thought they were all barbaric steppe people. And they tried to say, they have artillery that we don't have. They have tanks that we don't have. And then, of course, when he did all of this, he ended up, at the end of his life, admiring Stalin and hating Churchill and Roosevelt. And he said at one point, if I had won the war, I would have executed them, but I would have given a private estate to Stalin, because he was in such admiration that Stalin had killed everybody. He killed in the famine, he wiped out his officer corps, and Hitler felt that he was the only person with a nerve or the iron spine to challenge Hitler. So he had a love-hate relationship, but he miscalculated on all three considerations, and that one choice lost Germany the war.
And as we talked about before, it was the inability of others to have a role in persuading Hitler.
There was almost no general who wanted to go in. They were afraid to go in there.
Yeah.
Some of them had fought Russia on the Eastern Front, and they said things like, the European rail system and the European road system ceases about 100 miles into Russia, and it's not Europe anymore, and it's endless.
Yeah.
And the longer we go, the longer our supply. And there's a very famous quote from Army Group South where a commander, I think it's von Manstein, is told, no enemies ahead of us and no supplies behind us, meaning they just kept retreating and retreating endlessly.
Well, on that note, Victor, thanks very much for this time. We are just getting underway with this, our first in the three-part series for this fall. Obviously, we're just in the early stages of World War II, but next month we'll return and move a little further into these leadership decisions that were made and their importance for today's leaders and how we need to understand them today.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I look forward to it.
Thanks so much for joining us for this, the beginning of Season 2 of Office Hours with Victor Davis Hanson. If you'd like to learn more about the School of Public Policy, please check us out at publicpolicy.pepperdine.edu or check out the link underneath this video on our YouTube channel. Thanks so much for joining us.